to the Oral History Project. We're here in Philadelphia at the American Society of Criminology meetings in 2017, and it's my honor to introduce Professor Lawrence Sherman from the University of Cambridge, University of Maryland. I'm John MacDonald, professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and we're going to be talking about Larry's lifetime work in criminology. Just a few highlights I'll mention first. Professor Sherman was awarded a PhD at Yale University in sociology and has had a distinguished career. Appointment at the State University of New York, Albany, University of Maryland, professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Cambridge University, back at the University of Maryland again. In the course of his career, he's won a number of important awards, including the Sutherland Award from the American Society of Criminology. He was also past president of the American Society of Criminology, and I could go on and on with a number of other awards. His major works have included the first randomized trial on domestic violence, arrest for domestic violence, the first randomized trial on the effectiveness of hotspots policing, and he is considered the founding father of the field of evidence-based policing. So with that introduction, I'd like to talk to Larry about the course of his career and what brought him to criminology in the first place.
Thanks.
So Larry, what brought you into the field of criminology?
Well, I think growing up in the 60s, the impact of violence in this country at that time was unescapable. The violence against civil rights protesters, the freedom riders who went to the South, the murder of several of them who were buried in a dam, blowing up churches where children were killed, and then seeing the police involved in having dogs attack Martin Luther King. My parents went to the Washington Mall to the Lincoln Memorial when Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. Wouldn't let me go because I was a little too young, but I could watch it at home on television. And reading the Washington Post every day and seeing more things that brought together the whole issue of violence and the police institution and racism in America really gave me a very strong interest. And I still remember the day I picked up the Washington Post and saw the headline from a study that it turns out had been done by Al Reese, who later became my PhD supervisor. I'm about 14 years old, and I'm reading this survey that he had done with his observers in the patrol cars in Washington, Boston, and Chicago, reporting that the majority of white police had racist attitudes, which was probably quite consistent with other evidence we had at that time. And so I got really interested in all these issues, and along came Vietnam, when I thought I was heading towards a career in politics where I could try to do something about this the way my heroes like John and Bobby Kennedy had done. But with Vietnam, it turns out I had a very low draft lottery number 75, so they were taking up to 150 that year.
Right.
And I was going to go into the Army unless I did something about it. And I decided that I wouldn't go the pathway of joining the public health service because I might wind up working on water treatment, a subject that actually interests me greatly now, but at the time...
You didn't see the connection to
No,
criminology at the time.
I didn't see it really being responsive to the spirit of the 60s. So I decided to become a conscientious objector, which was a legal way to avoid serving in the U.S. military as a draftee. It was also a political kiss of death because nobody would vote for a conscientious objector for high political office. And the controversy that hit Bill Clinton for even having gone into the reserves, allegedly through influence, in which he made the world safe for the next president, who had also gone into the reserves, and apparently for another president who didn't get caught up in that at all. But what it told me was I was going to have to really just focus much more on what I could do about violence. And I had this amazing opportunity to work in the New York City government, which pretty quickly led to my being, the third day in the office, led to my being involved in a prison riot that took over all of the prisons in New York City with 17,000 inmates, 5 different prisons, and then to the police department.
So what brought you to New York City? So you started off as with an undergraduate degree in political science, right? And thinking you were going to go into politics, like many people who major in political science, and then you had this shift. So what brought you to the actual city police, city government experience?
I had a great opportunity to do a joint master's degree with the University of Chicago in urban studies at the same time I was finishing my undergraduate degree at Denison. And at Chicago, I read about this Sloan Foundation program, the New York City Urban Fellowship, which is still going. 25 people a year are picked to work with the members of the cabinet of the mayor's role in New York City. It's the second largest government in terms of employees in the United States, right after the federal government. It's bigger than any state government. So it was a huge opportunity, and I somehow managed to get through the grueling interviews, walked out of one of them certain that I was not going to get the job. But I did, and then the Serpico revelations come out in the New York Times, and the mayor appoints a commission on police corruption, and the police commissioner resigns, and a reformer is appointed, Patrick V. Murphy, and I said I want to work for him, which I did, but at first I had to get through my draft board. And they said, well, what do you want to do as your alternative service as a conscientious objector? And this is on Monday morning after the Sunday, the day before, the Students for Democratic Society had exploded a bomb at police headquarters. Didn't kill anybody, but it pretty much blew up the front of the building at 240 Center Street. Anyway, I said I want to go work with the New York City Police Department. And they said, well, you might get killed. That's pretty good. We'll approve it. And so that's exactly what I did. And it was an amazing opportunity at an incredible time. The year I went to work there, New York City Police killed over 90 people, and 10 police officers were murdered through assassinations. It's a record year for citizen police violence in New York. It's now down to fewer than 10 people killed in an average year, and sadly still police officers getting killed, but not as many. Things have really gotten a lot better in New York in many ways, but I was able to see, if you will, the baseline, the sort of snapshot before the huge reforms began under Patrick V. Murphy, as kind of a sort of icebreaker for the entire country, and a major wave of police reform that I don't think people appreciate today, because our expectations are appropriately much higher.
So the fellowship typically, right, I would assume is for people who plan a kind of a career in public service, not academia. Is that correct?
Well, I would say that we had a number of PhD students, and a few of them went off to be academics, but most of them did go into public service, and we hear from time to time about people doing various things, but it's an amazing opportunity for anybody who cares about seeing a huge government in a democracy operating between the political pressures of the voters, of the labor unions who comprise the hundreds of thousands of workers in the government, and the news media, and all of those things coming together, which gave me, as a social scientist, a much more holistic and integrated view than you can get from any single theory or single sample of data, which kind of plucks out little bits here and there. But every day I got to see it all put together, and then at night I'd go out and ride in police cars and have political discussions with the cops in the cars while we're out chasing people with the gun reports. And one night an officer stuck a rifle in my throat after he found it at a man with a gun call, and he thought I was one of the kids who was hanging out with a gun. It's because I was one of the kids, 21 years old at the time. But it was a way to learn that I think was unparalleled.
So, you know, what brought you to Yale Sociology to ultimately work with Al Reese from that experience? Did you see an opportunity working with the police and think, I want to study this in a sociology program?
Well, what happened was that Al Reese's work for the President's Crime Commission with Donald Black got turned into a Yale University Press book, And the New York Times got a copy of the book from Yale Press to review. They sent it to Patrick Murphy's office as police commissioner to see if he'd write a book review. I walked into his secretary's office and I said to Peggy Triplett, what's that book there? And she said, well, the commissioner was asked to review, but he doesn't want to do it. Do you want the book? You can have it. So she gave me the book, and I read it, and I was coming to the end of my 2 years of alternative services conscientious objector, and I had gotten a fellowship to go to Cambridge for a year and study criminology, but I knew I was probably not going to go to law school or go down that political route, and I thought maybe I should go to Yale and study with this guy and do more research on police.
So there was some serendipity to this.
Complete serendipity, and I wrote him a letter, and he invited me to come up, and we talked for 2 hours in New Haven, and he gave me a long list of people I should contact in Europe. He hooked me up with the French police and other experts in police research. And then I applied to Yale, and I got rejected because my math GRE score was too low. And a friend of mine who was a doctoral student went to see Al Reese and said, well, you know, Sherman's actually saved some money. He could pay his own way. So was this a fellowship decision or an admissions decision? And Al said, well, actually, we can let him in if he can pay his own way. So the next thing I know, I got unrejected. And the rest is history. I finished up working with him, and he was an amazing mentor. Not for everybody, as Candace Krishnet and others will tell you, but for me, he was really just true.
And you recently won the Wilbur Cross Award from Yale, which is an award given for distinguished alums. So turns out the GRE is not a very good predictor of ultimately success of graduates.
Well, I might have done better if I hadn't walked out of the math section of the GRE saying this is hopeless, I can't possibly deal with it. And it's the main reason I became an experimentalist, because if you have a good experiment, you don't need any fancy algebra. You can just look at the difference in averages, and you know essentially what the result is. So that's my defense. I think experiments might be hard to pull off in terms of organization, but analytically they're very straightforward, and I'm always very confident in talking about what experiment results mean, because I don't have to be worried about whether I've gotten these models wrong. But that's probably no encouragement to people who didn't do well in math, like my son in university, but then he studied for a year very hard, and he got terrific math scores in his GREs. And maybe I should have done that too. So it's just an admission of my laziness, regrets for not having worked harder.
So during your graduate career, so first you went from Cambridge for that master's degree. Was there anything you experienced at Cambridge that you brought with you to Yale in terms of your focus as a sociology PhD student?
Yes, I was lucky to have a really good theoretical education at Cambridge with people like Roger Hood and Richard Sparks, who had just written a book on key issues in criminology. They were great teachers, and I could come to it with that, plus some work on law, criminal justice administration, including correctional stuff, things that really weren't taught at Yale because they were sort of too specific and too deeply into criminology for a sociology department, where we spent a lot of time talking about Max Weber and Emil Durkheim. I even wrote some stuff about that while I was at Yale, but I was really glad I could start out in Cambridge, and I like to think that we're still providing that for our MPhil students in the one-year course.
Great. And so what was the focus then of your, obviously, you're world renowned for your work in policing, police-related scholarship, but what was the focus initially when you were a doctoral student? I know Reese was one of your mentors, and he became, very well known obviously for his work in policing, but did you start off knowing that that's what you were going to do, working with him?
Absolutely. I had my topic the day I walked in the door at Yale. In fact, the day I walked in the door at Cambridge, which was to understand what was going on in New York that I had been a part of, which was revolutionary, using undercover agents and covert investigations, to measure the level of police corruption, to apprehend corrupt officers in very large conspiracies, and to create a huge deterrent effect against police corruption. And Al's interest in organizations, which is a general area of theory that not many people know he was very strong in. In fact, one of his students, Rosbeth Moss-Kanter, became editor of the Harvard Business Review. He was a really great person to advise me on how to think about the ways in which organizations interact with their environments, like the prosecutors, the news media, how scandals get created, and even the whole dynamic of whether stigma can be pinned on an organization, or whether the organization can push the stigma, like pin the tail on the donkey, which is a metaphor he used. And since then, it's been amazing to see the President of the United States do exactly what Al Ries was talking about theoretically at Yale in 1973, 74.
So that training in German sociology turned out to be very relevant. So your work, out of your dissertation, you published your first major work, I believe.
Scandal and Reform, Controlling Police Corruption, University of California Press, 4 case studies, mostly qualitative.
Right, so it was a qualitative, what people in political science would call public management in some ways, right?
Yeah, it was full of numbers about measuring the level of organization of corruption that was revealed by investigations, which declined significantly from having 100 participants in one conspiracy down to the average case having 1 or 2 people. And this was with 500 people being assigned to investigate other police officers in a police force of 35,000 or so. So it was using measurements in a very small way in relation to the much larger story of what is the theoretical context for the transformation of an organization's culture, its integrity, and the public image of it, and how it all related to ultimately deterrence theory as a way of reinforcing doing the right thing.
So what led you from that work, thinking about police reform and organizational reform and theoretically how to make it happen, to wanting to run field trials and figure out what works in police and police effectiveness?
Well, the deterrence part of it was, I suppose, the link, because after I finished the corruption work, I got very interested in police killings of citizens and got an NIMH grant to do case studies of reforming that dimension of policing. At the same time, Jim Fife was doing his research about New York killing fewer people at the same time they became less corrupt. I was studying a New York police veteran who became chief in Kansas City, Joe McNamara. He reformed in Kansas City shooting. Lee Brown, who got a PhD or a D-Crim in criminology from Berkeley, became police chief in Atlanta, Georgia. He also restricted police shootings. And so I was working on these case studies, again, sort of public management, but with a deterrence edge, because it was a change in policy that said you may not shoot somebody who is running away from you. You can't shoot people in the back if they're not providing a threat to public safety. And when they did this, the number of people killed by the police sharply dropped. So I developed that in context of deterrence, and it was later cited by the Supreme Court in Tennessee v. Garner when in 1985 they made that policy that I was studying the law of the land. And they cited the research that showed not only would it reduce killings by police, but it also would not increase killings of police or increase the crime rate, which had been the objection in an earlier Court of Appeal case in Tennessee. But the deterrence link, to answer your question about doing experiments, was again serendipitous. The National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences, had published a report on the National Institute of Justice, what was then called the National Institute of Law Enforcement. And they recommended that the research they funded become more theoretical and that it engage the methods of field experiments to test for deterrent effects of various kinds of policies. And at the same time, the feminist advocates for the protection of victims of domestic violence had succeeded in getting the Minnesota legislature to give police special powers for misdemeanor assault arrests in the case of domestic assault, even if they hadn't witnessed the offense, which under the common law was a requirement. So this was a new special power. The police didn't want to use it. And my mentor in New York City, who was not actually the police commissioner, but one of his chief aides, Tony Boza, who'd been born in Spain, came to New York when he was 15, and was just totally committed to the idea of knowledge and research to improve policing. He had a master's degree himself in the 1960s while he was working his way up the chain of command. He became chief of police in Minneapolis at the same time that the National Institute of Justice put out an RFP for experiments in deterrence. So I said to him, can we randomly assign arrests? He said, sure. And I sat down and wrote the proposal, and he took it through the mayor and the city council. At the time, the police didn't want to make arrests. And so everybody figured we have nothing to lose. If we want to see more arrests, at least we can get them to do it by random assignment. And we were able to get the funding and then go ahead and do the experiment. And as you know, that led to other experiments on the deterrent effects of police practices in a variety of ways. But it was a kind of watershed moment with those coincidences of things happening at the same time that set the precedent for doing that kind of experimental work with police practices. And the police were happy to do it. Prosecutors refused, many other people refused, but the police were always very open-minded about what the results might be, and they were encouraged to be thought of as worthy of that kind of work. And so it turned out to be a lot easier than a lot of people thought it would be. Mind you, the Kansas City Preventive Patrol experiment had really broken the ice in 1974 with the Police Foundation's experiment led by George Kelly. And I have to acknowledge that experiments in policing really began with that study. Whatever its limitations, it was the burst of energy and the front page headline in the New York Times, which I think was actually wrong, and that is how many police you have doesn't matter, but it certainly got attention to the experimental method, and it showed that, you know, people, the sky isn't going to fall if you randomly assign a police decision to have more or less resources or make arrests or what have you.
In that study, even the report, if I'm not mistaken, says that the finding isn't more or less police equal more or less crime. It's really about response, right? Patrol.
Well,
I mean, there's, I think, a key line in there where it says that they're not actually looking at the effect of more police, or more looking at, you know, where police are deployed.
Well, the original Kansas City experiment actually couldn't measure where the police were deployed.
Right.
And so when we moved into another area of my work, which is not about deterrence, it's about the distributions of crime in time and space, which led to the discovery of hotspots. So I like to think I've discovered some things that are just part of the natural world, like these huge concentrations of crime in space. More recently, I've been discovering huge concentrations of harm among a tiny percentage of all victims, and trying to get police to target differentially according to how much harm a victim is suffering or an offender is committing, as distinct from the number of offenses, which is kind of misleading because offenses are not all created equal. And if you go with low harm, high volume, you're kind of wasting your opportunity to protect the most vulnerable, to prevent the greatest amount of harm, which can be measured in a variety of ways. But both harm and crime in time and space are extremely concentrated in small percentages of all of the units. That's called a power curve, not the normal curve, but this big tail up at the very end. And by discovering that, just as I went to Rutgers, where David Weisberg had gotten me invited to be a visiting professor, we had these great conversations about, well, why don't we do an experiment around these peaks of crime concentration, the hotspots where 3% of the addresses in Minneapolis had over half of all of the police calls for service. And we designed an experiment that would focus on those places so that we could measure the thing that the Kansas City experiment couldn't measure, which is how much time do the police spend in any location. And so we had 18 graduate students with a clipboard and a stopwatch, and they were actually counting the number of minutes that they saw the police out in the field. Al Reese loved that kind of stuff. He used to tell me about the biologists who were out in the field putting things on beavers to measure the amount of time they were underwater or up in the beaver's lodge, or the way they do recapture sampling for birds in flight. Real science for him was not in a laboratory, although certainly real science can be done in a laboratory. It certainly wasn't in a survey of asking people their recollections. It was going out and watching things, which is what
systematically recording them.
Systematically recording what you see in the field. So in the spirit of Al Reese, we did what the Kansas City experiment didn't do, which was to measure how much time the police were spending in the high patrol places versus the local patrol places. And then we went through a whole period in which hotspots experiments couldn't afford to do that, so they didn't. So we don't really know how much difference there was in what I call the dosage of patrol. Some people don't like that, but I think it's a proper way to describe the dosage response curve, which is pretty standard in medical statistics, as you know, John. And now with the GPS embedded in the police radios, or at least in the patrol cars, we're able to get tons of information about exactly the number of minutes, the arrival, the departure. We're able to do a lot more than ever with systematic observation. Even though we don't have to have people do it, we can use the technology.
Right. So you went from studying police reform, scandal and reform, to studying police use of deadly force, to studying the effect of arrest on domestic violence, to looking at the distribution of police in reducing crime. Was any of this planned, this journey, where all these kind of transitions, where they were, or are they just responses to what you saw kind of as priorities in society?
Well, the larger question is, how do we have a less violent society? And that, I would argue, is the main research question of my career, which then was answered in lots of different ways around what Herman Goldstein would call a problem-specific focus, of not biting off too much all at once, but looking at very specific kinds of violence, like domestic abuse, or intimate partner violence, even as distinct from family violence, and then comparing that to robbery. And incidentally, in the Kansas City preventive patrol experiment, there was a lower level of robbery where there were more police supposed to be, but as Al Bloomstein pointed out, the power was too small because they only had 15 beats. So they said, well, it wasn't statistically significant. And that was part of my education about how it doesn't matter that you say it's not significant if you don't have enough power to detect something as significant when it's as big as a 40% reduction in robbery. In our hotspots experiment in Minneapolis, David Weisberg and I found 50% reductions in robbery, where we had the police present about twice as often as in the hotspots where they weren't.
So what brought you kind of your next journey, intellectual journey, in terms of looking at trying to remove guns off the streets in the work you did in Kansas City?
Well, I have to say here that because we'd already done experiments, and because James Q. Wilson had been a very effective advocate for experiments in the Reagan-Bush administration, and had persuaded Chip Stewart, James K. Stewart, who was the director of the National Institute of Justice in the 1980s, when the crack epidemic exploded in the late 80s, and when actually arrests of black people for drug offenses exceeded arrests of white people per capita for the first time, there was this explosion of violence, especially juvenile murders, in big cities suffering the crack epidemic. And for lots of reasons, including the Attorney General, Richard Thornton, deciding to run for U.S. Senator when Senator Hines was killed in a plane crash. And the last thing he did was to create a weed and seed program in Kansas City because he thought it was a good place to illustrate his interest in fighting crack. He gave them the money, and they called on me to help design an experiment that would try to get gun violence, especially drive-by shootings, down in this area by using the experimental method. And so we tried to develop a way to detect guns and discourage people from carrying guns on the street, drawing on the work of Mark Moore and James Q. Wilson. Wilson had a piece in the New York Times that said, just take their guns away, forget gun control. Now, I don't think the second part was right, but I do think that if you deter people from gun carrying on the street, there's going to be fewer shootings on the street. And I would argue that now 8 studies, not randomized trials, but 8 consistent findings that when you proactively engage with people in ways that might reveal that they're carrying guns illegally, that there is a reduction in gun carrying, and accordingly there's a reduction in gun violence. So again, it's going right back to my concern with murder, to what I lived with in New York City in 1971, with all of the violence going on there. And it was really very heartwarming to see that the gun violence had dropped in half with this pilot program we had in Kansas City. And in a way, it's still more satisfactory to me than what happened with the domestic violence research, where we did further research that got pretty much ignored because people didn't want to hear a more complicated story. And with the stop and search, there's a lot of people who are still quite angry about our concluding that stop and search in a high gun violence area saves lives. And that claim, which I think has lots of evidence, is complicated by the fact that some places, arguably New York City around 2010, were vastly overusing stop and search independent of a gun crime problem. So they didn't have the serious violence to justify the intrusion on liberty of 700-some thousand searches a year in a city of 7 million, so a ratio of 1 to 10. And remember at that point that the homicide rate had dropped by over 95%. So that's citywide, but more importantly, if you're doing searches in gun crime hotspots and you're saying things like, excuse me, but there's been a lot of gun violence around here, so for your safety and mine, do you mind if I just ask you to stand on the wall so I can stop and frisk? Which is a whole lot different from saying, up against the wall!
Right.
And the famous picture of 4 young men holding their hands up against the wall, and one of them has a small dog who's got his hands up against the wall, implication being that people get treated like dogs during stop and search. It doesn't have to be that way, and we confuse the medium with the message. The message is, if you're carrying guns illegally, there is a risk that you will get caught and you'll have to spend some time in jail for having carried that gun, and they'll take your gun away. So if you don't want to run that risk, then leave your gun at home. And that's what I think the Kansas City officers did in a polite and respectful way, with no complaints against them the entire time.
So did you actually have a protocol then for the Kansas City work you were doing? Were officers trained on a particular form of questioning people and looking for guns?
They were trained on what to look for by Edward Gallagher of the New York City Police Department, who was a detective in 15 years, had seized over 1,000 guns. And the way he did it was to study his body language when he had a gun concealed in his clothing. And he would watch himself in a mirror and the movements he was making naturally to keep the pistol stuck inside his waistband under his shirt, keep the pistol from dropping down the leg of whoever's carrying it. So he knew that if you're running for a bus, that you have to hold on to your waist belt to avoid losing the gun. And he went out on the streets of New York City and he just looked for that body language that he recognized. And his hit rate for stopping somebody for a stop and frisk and finding a gun was huge. And in fact, the Prime Minister of England made the hit rate the real test for stop and search. I don't think that really the purpose is to find guns. I think the purpose is to stop the guns from killing people. Right. But still, Gallagher's hit rate was quite striking. So we flew him out to Kansas City, and he explained all this to these officers who were going to work overtime on this project to try to deter gun violence. And he also talked about the way he would speak to people, We didn't follow any particular script, but we did reject some academic ideas like using a handheld metal detector, which struck me as a great idea at the time. And so we're in the room with these officers who are going to have to do it, and they said, do you know what we have to do with a handheld metal detector while we search somebody? We have to have our gun in the other hand in case they try to pull out a gun on us. And if they turn to run, then we might have to drop the metal detector to run after them. Somebody will steal it, and then we'll have to fill out lots of paperwork on how we lost the metal detector. So they didn't want to have anything to do with a metal detector. And of course, you can't just sort of hold the metal detector up while you're driving down the street and tell if somebody's got a gun on them. The ACLU was working with us at the time, and NIJ had some grants out for hardware that would allow you, like a speed camera, to point it at somebody and it would reveal a gun underneath their clothing. Sadly, that technology hasn't come along, but it would be much less intrusive than what police have to do to find guns in gun crime areas. So I still stand by the notion that there is a moral balance when people are dying to use something as intrusive as stop and search to deter people from carrying guns. But that should be confined to the very highly predictable micro areas, the hotspots of gun violence, where there's moral justification that you can use to explain to the people that you're stopping and searching. You can't do that in a low gun crime area. And that's been, I think, a source of confusion and a lot of anger, and I think a failure of imagination and vision on the part of police leadership in cities that have used lots of stop and search. A failure to explain that or even to strategize it to be that strategically focused on tiny areas rather than broader.
So the context is deeply important, as well as the temporariness of it, if you will, right? So what you're arguing is that at some point you might have to, if the violence comes down, you don't need to keep delivering the same treatment.
Well, and I think the more you explain all of that, and I'm always urging police leaders to talk to the public about what the police are doing and why. And I think some people like Bill Bratton have done a lot more of that than some other leaders, and been conscious of phrases like predictive policing or precision policing. But again, to nail that down in terms of what does it mean for people who live in certain neighborhoods, and what is the way in which they need to be aware of police practice in those neighborhoods, and what's benefiting them out of the application of research evidence from other cities to their neighborhoods, so that they and their kids might have a better chance of surviving a period of high violence. All those explanations are really part of community policing, but they're very hard to get the message across, either through mainstream media or even social media, if you don't have the right people supporting your message. So maybe it's not the police commissioner who should get the message out, maybe it's the local ministers or the other community leaders who can be given a lot of time to see the data, to look at the research, to be convinced that this is something that's good for the community, and then to have them sell it. So I think that's the kind of work that we've got to do to put research to work in policing, not just persuading police, but persuading police to use the research to persuade communities that these are strategies that are good for the communities, but with a very surgically limited form of applying these policies rather than a kind of overspilling. It's funny, in agriculture now, they're talking about slaughter harvesting, in which you're harvesting a lot of crops that shouldn't be harvested yet. And there's a new generation of technology that will only harvest the plants that are in the field that are ready to be harvested and leave the rest. And they're doing the same thing with fertilizer. So they're saving lots of money, and they're being much more precise and limited, and they're trying to avoid collateral damage. Well, if you think about policing a community like growing a wheat crop, it's actually an interesting metaphor, that you don't want to slaughter the whole community in the process of harvesting just that wheat that's ready to go, and leaving the rest of it alone.
Preventing the next dust bowl.
or preventing the next person from getting angry from being stopped and searched, and they turn into a criminal because of the collateral damage of stop and search.
So if you took all the work that you've done, important work, kind of being the first mover in some of these areas in policing, what made you sit down and write kind of this manifesto, if you will, on evidence-based policing, and kind of come up with both the term, but also kind of lay out the vision for applying experimental and quasi-experimental methods to figure out what works in policing?
Well, I had a long trip back from Australia where John Braithwaite had invited me to set up some experiments testing a new police method called restorative justice conferences. And it's a very long flight from Australia back to Washington. And I had this book about a new field called evidence-based medicine. And it was a wonderful book called Demanding Medical Excellence by Michael Millinson. And I read that book almost cover to cover on the way back. Every page is marked up with connections between the progress they made in improving medicine through research that both targeted medical interventions more precisely and then tested how well they worked, and then tracked things like, are the doctors washing their hands before they go to the next patient so they won't spread a disease. So the targeting, testing, and tracking ideas that I didn't crystallize for another 15 years actually, that all came out of reading the history of recent history of evidence-based medicine, which is a name that only came around in 1992, and I was reading this book in 1997, 98, and then I got invited to give a lecture at the Police Foundation, which I chose to call Evidence-Based Policing, and to use a lot of the experiments that people were doing in policing by then, as well as the hotspots research and targeting decisions, to say, look, we can pull this together. We can have a field of criminal justice in which police justify what they're doing, not based on their experience, but based on a very highly developed body of knowledge about how to do this very precisely and with maximum effect and minimal intrusion in people's civil liberties. And a lot of people think that vision is crazy. Many of them are police who think policing is essentially a craft that you learn by experience, and spending time learning a lot of these studies and their results won't be of any use. But actually, by sticking with it now for over almost 20 years, we've got a lot of police now very excited about the idea that police should base their legitimacy on their competence through research in knowing what to do to protect people, to prevent harm in various situations. Not to catch more people and to make sure they get punished, which I think is the predominant view of the mission of the police among people who become police officers. But I've got this bust of Sir Robert Peel that was made in the 19th century. It's about this big, and I carry it into every oral presentation of a research thesis by our mid-career police students to say, okay, now Peel said the purpose of police is not punishment, it's prevention. Tell us how your research will improve our ability to prevent crime and harm. And they love it. And Peel is a great inspiration, just like August Vollmer is in American policing. And I think heroes are a good thing to have, not only for police but for communities. And if we can tell the story of these heroic visions of building a safer society through police, then we might be able to discourage people from saying, let's defund the police, let's get rid of the police can't do any good. The evidence from police strikes shows us that's a really dangerous idea.
Police leads to chaos. So in terms of connections, to medicine, just one thing I was going to ask you is, do you think that that connection you've made has makes people kind of the idea of evidence more relevant when you can show how it's worked in medicine and how it could work in policing? Is there something just people innately connect with?
Yeah, I had one of my recent students tell me the other day that he'll always remember my lecture on Ignaz Semmelweis, who was the Viennese physician in an obstetrics hospital who was worried about 15% of the mothers who had just given birth dying of childbed fever, it was called. But mostly in the 2 wards where they were attended by medical students, and they weren't dying in the wards that were attended only by nurses. And he tried to figure out what was going on, and he reasoned that, well, the medical students all come to see the mothers after they've been doing dissections of dead bodies all morning, and of course they didn't wash their hands. So he thought there might be some bad air or something that they'd carry on their hands, and he had them wash their hands in carbolic acid before they went into the maternity wards. And the death rates plummeted with this experiment. And he went to the head of the hospital and said, I've got this great solution to childbed fever. And the head of the hospital said, are you accusing doctors of killing all those women? You will never practice medicine in this town again. And he didn't. So it's a pretty compelling story about how good evidence about how to save lives is not necessarily going to be welcomed if it cuts into institutional interests. And Semmelweis died in a mental hospital. So I wasn't sure whether police liked this story or whether it made much impact on them. But this student was telling me what a vivid connection that gave him to talking to police officials in his police force who were not interested in new knowledge, who just dismissed it, saying, well, that must be nonsense. And it gave him some hope that if people are rebuffing him, it's not necessarily because he's crazy, it's because they're closed-minded, and he shouldn't give up. He should keep trying. And now he's actually turned his entire police department on to invoking research to decide which cases to investigate and which cases not to, so they can make better use of their scarce resources. He's transforming that department, in part because of that medical story that I just gave.
That analogy, well, it's great. So that I think brings me to some questions I had about not only your research career, but your career in as a professor and also an institutional builder in criminology. And for those who are students of criminology, I'm sure they'd like to hear about, some of the things that you've done in terms of creating a first department in criminology at Yale University, the creation of the Stockholm Prize, and some of these other things you've accomplished. So, do you have any kind of thoughts about, your kind of the trajectory you've had in terms of, building programs, University of Maryland, University of Pennsylvania, now Cambridge, creating awards?
Well, as you know, I'd like to thank my parents, which is why you have a Donald and Margaret Sherman Fund for Violence Prevention at the University of Pennsylvania. And the reason I thank them is because they were always institution builders, primarily in the church, but when they were in their 80s, they were the founders of the United Nations Association of Central Pennsylvania. They had both worked at the UN as non-governmental observers, my father for the YMCA and my mother for the American Baptist Convention. And when they got to Central Pennsylvania, they were shocked at all the anti-UN attitudes when they know that the UN is helping refugees from wars and violence situations all around the world, and UNESCO, UNICEF, all of the good things that the UN does. And today, long after my parents are dead, the UN Association in Central Pennsylvania State College, Penn State University, is thriving with all sorts of supporters. And they don't need to remember who founded it. It's just important that the institution is there. So that's part of my family's sectarian history. Seymour Lipset said America is the first sectarian nation. It has good consequences as well as bad. And a lot of the Civil War might be explained by this sort of intolerance and my way or the highway attitude that you get with a sectarian nation as opposed to a state religion top down. But my own background in seeing the importance of building institutions helped me to understand why we have a Harvard, Yale, Princeton, why they have much bigger endowments than the University of Pennsylvania, in part because the Calvinist sects, which built the first 3 universities, made creation of institutions, giving money to institutions, my father always gave 10% of his income back to the institution he worked for because he believed in the Young Men's Christian Association and in fact merging it with the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association. That was my role model. And so when I had an opportunity to build new institutions, and two of them actually happened about the same time. One was the obvious low-hanging fruit of creating a criminology department at a university that had two of the greatest criminologists in American history, first Thorsten Saline, who went there in the 1920s, and then his student Marvin Wolfgang. Those studies that they did made everybody think there was a department of criminology at the University of Pennsylvania, but there wasn't. There was a sociology department. And I went there as a professor of sociology at a time when Doug Massey was the chair, and we had the great support from another institution builder who wasn't from a sectarian background, but whose mother told him to give back to society in important ways. And Jerry Lee wanted to help build criminology because he believed that research was the best way to try to reduce crime. And with his support for a research center, Doug Massey came to me and said, why don't you create a department of criminology? And we could really strengthen social sciences, and we could have joint appointments and have more reasons for people to come into this area of undergraduate study. And he didn't have to ask twice, but what we did have to do was quite a bit of work to persuade the Faculty of Arts and Sciences to create the first new department in 3 decades. And that opportunity was supported by Judy Rodin, who later went on to be president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Not every president would have wanted to go in that direction, but she had done a lot to reduce crime in West Philadelphia, to transform the neighborhood around Penn to make it better for the university, but also better for the community, creating lots of jobs for people who lived in the area. So she supported it, and I was able to ultimately hire great people like you and to look back and see that institution is going on and will do long after anybody remembers how it was created. And roughly at the same time, again with Jerry Lee's help, we were able to create the Stockholm Prize in Criminology, which ultimately attracted endowment money from both the Swedish government and the foundations in Sweden. In roughly, actually the majority of it was from the Söderberg Foundation, but it's now going to be lasting, God willing, for hundreds of years, just like the Nobel Prizes, because when an institution kind of permanent endowment, the record is those institutions last longer. And the longest surviving institutions in Western civilization are supported by endowments, the state churches and the universities. And other institutions that I can build, like societies of experimental criminologists, or the Society of Evidence-Based Policing, which was actually founded by Alex Murray, one of our students at Cambridge, when he asked how he could help to support this. And I said, it'd be great if you could get police together to talk about research. And now there are over 5,000 members worldwide of Societies of Evidence-Based Policing, which have the 3 principles of doing more research, applying research in policing, and communicating to the public and police officers what the research has found. And that probably is the institutional framework that I would be most proud of, because it takes us full circle as to why we have universities. And as Benjamin Franklin said about the first secular university in the world, the University of Pennsylvania, he said, we want both ornamental knowledge like philosophy, art, poetry, Latin, Greek, ornamental but also useful.
Right.
Agricultural arts, engineering, building canals, clean water, clean air, safe cities.
Research that's practical.
Practical and beautiful,
Yeah.
that improves our lives and makes our curiosity whetted to learn more about the way the world works, but combining that with the day-to-day improvement in how we can deal with very complicated problems more effectively.
So in terms of, you've had this, amazing career in terms of scholarship, accomplishments, intellectual, personal, societal. You've helped build institutions, create a department, a major award. Talk a little bit about the last decade, which I would say in some way you've been playing the role of science diplomat in terms of trying to translate evidence-based policing to actual police practitioners and get them using it in the field. So can you talk a bit about what that experience has been, what you've been up to in terms of this past decade?
Well, it's interesting that this past decade connects back to 2 years out of graduate school when something we didn't talk about, which is the National Advisory Commission on Higher Education for Police Officers, was created by the Police Foundation, and they appointed me executive director as an assistant professor, and I wrote the report, The Quality of Police Education, which about 3 people here at the ASC meetings would have read. This book recommended that policing receive a much higher level of educational background before anybody becomes a police officer. We were inspired by Egon Bittner's work, saying what you really need is a graduate school of policing, like a graduate school of social work. So an undergraduate liberal arts degree to give you a broad view of the world, help you understand cause and effect, as well as art and history. And then you take a 2-year apprenticeship plus classroom kind of course in actually doing police work. Now, nobody's ever done that, but we got close to it when my predecessor's director of the Cambridge Institute, Sir Anthony Bottoms, agreed to create a part-time master's degree for people who were about to become police chiefs. In 1996, Cambridge started teaching groups of 50 very senior officers about applying criminology to police work. And it lasted for about 8 years as a requirement for all new police chiefs to have that course. Then the politics changed, the government canceled the funding, but Cambridge decided to keep the course going. And it's sort of struggled on for a few years until, without even thinking about that program, I went to Cambridge and was given the opportunity to take the program over and allowed to transform it around the evidence-based policing idea. And that was perhaps the opportunity of a lifetime to engage very smart, very committed people who had succeeded, often without any higher education at all. Some of them left school at age 15. And they're going right into a master's degree program at Cambridge after having learned a tremendous amount of things, rising to the senior levels of British policing with hundreds of thousands of people working for them. And they turned out to be excellent students. They work very hard, and they're very good at conceiving of research questions in policing and using good research methods. So all of that has just built more and more interest by police, not in having a requirement that they know this stuff, but in wanting to have it for its own sake. The real ideal for education is that it's not about the credential, it's not about the requirement, it's about having the knowledge because you want to know the answer and you want, in some cases, to be able to put it to work. So that what's happened at Cambridge is that we've gone from having about 15 to 20 students in this course to this year when we have 172. And it's going to be hard to sustain that, but we have a number of things in play, including a new apprenticeship levy in British government that may actually fund more police officers to take this course, and to maybe make the top-down transition in terms of higher education for policing, rather than requiring every constable to have a bachelor's degree, which the 78 Commission recommended, the President's Crime Commission recommended. It's always been very controversial. It's alleged that it would limit diversity and also make it harder for the people who traditionally became police officers to get into police service. And so I think there's lots of reason to take the top-down approach and to try to make knowledge a driver of police decision-making at the higher levels, and that will, if there's a trickle-down theory that makes sense, maybe it's this one, as opposed to trickle-down economics. And I'm still very pleased to see that not only are we getting the more senior people to support evidence in police decision-making, but even inspectors, sergeants, some constables fact, some of our best research is being done by technically skilled constables who get into solvability algorithms and other fairly advanced statistics. There's tremendous talent in the British police service, I think in the American police service, the Australian police service. We've got about 10 countries actually participating in this course. And it's been amazing to teach mid-career people rather than 21-year-olds who haven't got much experience in working in organizations of any kind, let alone in criminal justice. And the best thing is when they say, "This is amazing stuff. Why didn't somebody teach us that 20 years ago?" And well, partly because the knowledge wasn't around 20 years ago, but partly because they were never trained in human behavior.
Right.
They get trained in the law, how to fill out forms, how to use your body to control people in conflict situations, but not how to persuade people to voluntarily comply by using your words. A little bit of verbal judo, but not the larger context. And as some of my colleagues said yesterday about a diversion program where the police were trained in the life course criminology theory about how you get somebody to desist from crime, they loved it so much that they then got angry and said, "I'm really annoyed that nobody told me this, and I've been trying to manage offender behavior at the serious end for 5 years. Why didn't somebody explain to me what we know about crime and how to get people to stop it?" So that's, for me, a turning point in getting police to recognize that this sort of knowledge, that criminology as a discipline, is absolutely indispensable for doing a good job in crime prevention as police officers.
Well, it seems like a good connection to my next question, which was going to be, thinking about your experience both as a scholar, teacher, and I'll say science diplomat. What do you think are lessons that can be applied to kind of criminology as a discipline? Where do you see their opportunities, and where do you see their kind of shortcomings?
Well, you're very wise to ask me the question about being a science diplomat again, because actually I don't think that's what I've been doing. I think I've gone the opposite direction, because what diplomats do is to deal at a high level from government to government. And if you take, for example, climate change and the Paris Accords, and whether the United States as a government is going to participate in trying to produce less carbon and to slow down global warming. Many people are arguing now the U.S. government's irrelevant. It's the decisions of businesses, of local governments, and what you need to do is to reach much more broadly through networked decision making, and not go to the top and assume that there's a tight closed system in which the President of the United States or the U.S. Congress makes the decision that everybody falls into line with. That's not what happens. And in policing, if we persuade the head of the police in the British context, the Home Secretary, or if we persuade the major cities' police chiefs in the United States, the 75 biggest cities, that still leaves out massive numbers of organizations. And even if we persuade them, they can't get the hundreds or thousands of people who work for them to readily adopt the policies that the chiefs might prefer, because it's so hard to change their practices if you don't use the evidence-based approach to tracking what police are actually doing. So my view is that diplomacy is not so much the task as building a social movement, a professional social movement, a kind of grassroots consensus where people are converted one person at a time to see things differently, which is how I would argue attitudes to homosexuality were transformed in my lifetime, with the Gallup poll data to show it. In terms of the percentage of Americans who disapproved of homosexual lifestyles as opposed to approving. And that's just been a remarkable change, arguably a social movement in itself, but I don't think it happened through centralized leadership. I think it happened one-on-one with the same sort of process that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about in The Tipping Point, which is something that we teach in our course, and we encourage people who are opinion leaders already to think about their leverage in creating tipping points of changing behavior. And if we can think in terms of social networks, every time I have contact with the police department, I'm looking for opinion leaders who are articulate, friendly, likable people who can really change people's minds. I can rattle off a list of names of these opinion leaders, many of whom are now in evidence-based policing units, who just love the idea of getting people turned on to thinking about research findings.
So educating kind of the middle, if you'd say almost middle management, the future leaders, the people who have, can make change happen within organizations at a lower level.
Well, I would say even the present leaders, because some of these people are sergeants and they may never get promoted. But what they do as sergeants, when they organize 8 officers to work with them, randomly assigning 3 visits of 15 minutes to a hot spot over one patrol shift versus 9 visits of 5 minutes. So it's the same amount of police time, it's just cut up into more or less comings and goings. And they do an experiment like that, that's leadership. And then publishing it in the Cambridge Journal of Evidence-Based Policing so that thousands of police around the world can read what a sergeant and 8 officers did in Birmingham in 2015, that's leadership. And it's a legacy of knowledge that can't be taken away once it gets into what we hope will be our permanent digital library.
So interesting, there's, this been this kind of historic, I should say, kind of tension in the American Society of Criminology between practice and social science. I mean, I know that August Vollmer helped found the association, but a lot of the work being done, presented at the meetings even this week, isn't the kind of work that he probably would have envisioned when he helped found the society. So what do you think about kind of the hope for the future for linking, what you're talking about, these officers actually doing work, publishing it, and making that more part of the academy?
I'm very optimistic that the competing emphases of theory and application will be seen as more complementary rather than competitive. It is true that in 1941, the American Society of Police Training Officials was formed in August Vollmer's living room in the Berkeley Hills, and then later changed its name to the American Society of Criminology and had a big group pull out to become the International Association of Police Professors, or American Association, which is now the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. The question of why we have to speak separately is more cultural than it is intellectual. I think if we can get people who are very advanced theoretical and mathematical thinkers to consider applications or translational criminology as an important part of the field, and George Mason has such a journal now. John Loud, the former director of the National Institute of Justice, a great theorist, is a strong supporter of translational criminology. If we can have the theoretical side of criminology move in that direction of what are the implications of what we know from basic research for better policy and practice, and at the same time have practical people like police see the importance of a good theory, which they did in this diversion project, and the whole idea of offender desistance policing, which depends heavily on what we know about what works in desistance, from theoretically guided randomized controlled trials and all of the high standards of research that leads to publication in peer-reviewed journals. I think that ASC is now so big and divided into so many subsections that it's actually a better opportunity for bringing these competing strands together than we've ever had before. And I put it back to people like you who are running graduate programs and to think about the ways in which we could train PhD students to not just pass a comprehensive in theory or in administration of justice, but also a comprehensive exam in translation of research into practice, and having not so much to sit down and answer a question, but maybe a project in which one of the tools that you learn how to use in graduate school is putting research to work in a practice setting where you can actually get better outcomes for people and reduce harm and suffering early in your career, rather than just digging a deep and narrow hole on one theoretical kind of question that can be measured and tested in different ways. But while you're in graduate school, making you come up from that and look around and say, well, how does that connect to something over here?
How does that actually apply? How can it be applied? How can it be used? What about, kind of reflecting back on your career, also connecting it to kind of opportunities for the field of criminology more broadly? What do you think have been your, say, two biggest discoveries? And what do you see as things that it's hard to know what we need to discover, but what do you think in terms of opportunities for what's unknown that we really need to know?
Well, I like to talk about discoveries as well as inventions. And I think probably my biggest discovery was the distribution of crime in time and space across the cities that we have police data for.
So the whole idea, the whole term of a hotspot, right, came from that work.
Yes, and whether I was the first to use it, or actually I thought I got it from cancer research and other kinds of uses in epidemiology. But Glenn Pierce and others were looking at these distributions offense type by offense type. But what we had the opportunity to do in Minneapolis was to look at all offense types across all addresses in the city, and to use every address as part of the denominator, and to look at the concentration curve in space. And David Weisberg's work since then has just taken this miles further, so that that understanding, which has many parents, arguably, but I was one of them, that understanding of the importance of hotspots is really key to many other things that we've done. And Cristobal Weinborn has just done harm spots, and if he looks at distribution of harm in time and space, he finds it's even more concentrated than the counts of crimes. Which leads us to my second discovery, I think, and that is the distribution of harm across not just places and times, but also offenders and victims. One of our students in Cambridge showed that 3.7% of the victims suffered 85% of the harm in one county in England in 1 year. And that's more concentrated than crime in places. So pretty important for us to know, for us to think about the concentrations of harm as ways of setting priorities for police resources, for crime prevention, right across the criminal justice system. I think that is a basic science discovery that we will be working with for many years to come, possibly even reinterpreting previous evaluations of programs that said this doesn't work, it doesn't change the prevalence of repeat offending or even the frequency of repeat offending. And we showed yesterday in our assistance program, you get relatively small or non-significant differences on those traditional measures. You get a big effect on harm reduction in a sample of 400 offenders. So to take harm and to say, what about the invention? Well, actually, the way we know that is something I have invented, which is the Crime Harm Index. And it builds on previous work in surveying public attitudes about the relative severity of crimes, Celine and Wolfgang and so on, right at Penn. But it's expensive to do it that way, and it doesn't nearly approach the vast number of crimes that we deal with in the modern world. So we had an opportunity sitting there, and my PhD student, Chief Constable Peter Nehrude, had been a member of the Sentencing Guidelines Council in England and Wales, and I talked with him about how you could just apply the principles, independent of offender's prior record or other mitigating or aggravating circumstances, how you could apply the principles of those guidelines to each offense type, and then give that weighting to every offense that's in a criminal record or in a crime map in a community. And that invention, I think, can be as transformative in criminology as the microscope was in biology, because we can see things with it that we couldn't see otherwise.
So you basically were rethinking the way we measure crime in effect.
I think the findings are very compelling, that if we want to get what most people understand crime to be, the things that they're afraid of because they're very, very harmful, we've been missing the boat in counting the easy to count rather than what's important to count. And now, even though it's not a perfect way of doing this by any means, we are moving in the direction of trying to measure what is more important about criminal behavior. And looking at findings like the restorative justice experiments, where you don't get big drops in prevalence, but you do get very clear drops in severity of crime, whether you measure it by cost of crime, which again is expensive and complicated, or by the crime harm index, which Molly Slothauer's been doing with our 17-year follow-ups of the offenders in the Australian restorative justice experiments. The crime harm index approach as an invention is something that will have lasting impact on criminology. But evidence-based policing as an invention in the police institution is the bigger prize. And I've just in the past 6 months been able to work out a way in which technological advances to use algorithms, forecasting, or at least triaging all of the investigations as to whether they'll be successful or not for reactive police decision making, and then for proactive crime prevention with places, offenders, and victims. If we can put that information together in a way that police leaders can actually run the police 911 or 999 centers and to use much more strategic decision making about what the police should do at any given time, other than who made the last phone call, and some minimum wage dispatcher is under pressure to get all the calls out and to get a police car to go there, which is not a very good way to use tens of millions of dollars a year in police resources, or hundreds of millions, depending on the size of the police department. What we can do with evidence-based policing, I think, is to make it easier through decision support algorithms, so that we don't have to get everybody to be as expert as brain surgeons, but we still need everybody in the police force to understand the public health dimensions of policing as to what is the logic of how we are allocating resources, and what's my role when I get to a location, when I'm dealing with a victim of crime, or when I'm encountering a potential offender who might have his life changed by the arrest experience that he's about to get. If we can concentrate on a better engineering system for policing that we're trying to develop with evidence, we might even be able to cut the number of fatal shootings by police in the United States through what I want to call the Peace Project, or the police engineering of actions in citizen encounters. If we start thinking about citizen encounters the way the airlines think about planes taking off and landing, which now gives us 1.8 billion passenger flights a year without anybody, over 2 years, the last 2 years, nobody's died with that 1.8 billion people going through the process, whereas for every 68 million people who encounter the police in the United States in the last 3 years, one of them dies. So it's much more dangerous to encounter a police officer than to get on an airplane and go up 30,000 feet in the air. The difference is engineering. I think lots of other theories are out there, but let's try engineering as the most likely solution. And so if I can help to re-engineer police systems, that will be an invention that will be far more important than anything any one of us can do. And lots of people will have to participate. I'm hoping you're going to help too, John.
So it would connect you back in some ways to the beginning of your career, thinking about police reform, but thinking about now, evidence, experimental sometimes, but still connecting back to institutions, right? So your sociological training and thinking about bureaucracies, how to provide incentives, it's all kind of embedded in that last kind of in that piece on thinking about re-engineering police around shootings, I presume.
I think you're exactly right, and the difference in talking about engineering as a sociologist, especially with human systems where you've got to persuade people to change their minds, and pure engineering, which you have some family background in as well. As you well know,
It's far easier.
If
Pure
you're
engineering is much
going to
easier.
design a new machine and you press the button, you don't have to persuade people
Yeah.
to do anything except press the button, because the machine's going to do it all. But I think with policing it's much more complicated, and it's not only the police, it's also communities, it's also news media who are currently beating up on algorithms in a way that's perhaps too general, although not disclosing algorithms is a really bad idea, even though the courts are allowing it. And they shouldn't. They should make transparency for any data-driven decision framework that police use, so that democracies can own the police decision process by understanding it and knowing exactly how it's working. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't go ahead with algorithms and to try to improve the engineering of police practices so that fewer people die, whether they're police officers or citizens or anybody else. And I think we can do that. I think that's one of the possibilities of the incredible technological revolutions we've been living through, if we don't blow the opportunity, which we certainly can. But it's a knife edge. It's a question, like any turning point, of whether we as a society can pull together in support of knowledge, in support of broader dissemination of knowledge, which has been the main theme of the last 1,000 years, or at least the last 500 years. And we keep, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but if we all keep pushing forward, I think the police will benefit, and society in turn will benefit with having arguably a long trend towards a safer world, less violence, be the reward for our efforts.
So if you were to have kind of if you were to kind of think about, based on your career, advice you would have maybe for aspiring criminologists in the future, what would based reflecting on the last 40 years you've been at criminology? I think I'm right, close to 40 years.
Well, if you think of 1970 as when I started to work, it's getting
okay,
closer to
yeah.
50.
So if you were to think though, for the viewer who's maybe beginning graduate student or thinking about graduate school, what kind of advice would you have for just thinking, not that you can plan everything, but about opportunities, the future, criminology?
Well, Tony Bottoms once said that it's hard to be a serious criminologist without having a fundamental concern with morality. And I would encourage people who have a fundamentally moral inspiration for studying crime to do so. I would discourage people from coming into criminology because it's cool, or because it looks like a field in which there's jobs, and so it's a practical opportunity for them. There are many people in criminology with diverse motives and diverse background, but I think the people who have found the most meaning to their lives in a career in criminology are the people who have a sense of a higher purpose, beyond writing the next article, beyond getting promoted and getting tenure. Not that those things are unimportant. I certainly worked very hard and very clearly towards a tenure decision. But I still had, at every moment of thinking about my own job security, I had a sense of why I was doing this, which was certainly not just to get a secure job. It was to try to make the world a better place, to use a corny phrase. But James McGregor Burns' book about transformational leadership versus transactional leadership, it's mostly about the leadership, but I think if you look at it from a followership standpoint, if we as criminologists are both leaders and followers of new evidence, new knowledge, new theories, and we can make our own contribution to it, I think that we will live happier and more productive lives and get a better work-life balance as at the same time that we can look back with some satisfaction on things that we have accomplished. Even if it doesn't involve publication, even if it's teaching people who then understood something and went out and used that knowledge and happened to tell you 20 years later that it made a difference in their lives, that's really important stuff. I got a letter out of the blue from my first PhD student 15 years after she had defended, and she just told me how much of a difference it made at that point in her life, that I had given her the support that she needed in struggling with some other members of the faculty who didn't like her research methods. And again, these are, at the time they seem like petty conflicts, but if you see yourself not just as a criminologist but also as a teacher, if you are teaching, and the opportunity to make a real difference at a critical time in people's lives, that's another part of this idea of something outside yourself, something that's larger than you. So it's about others and not just me.
So being driven by that desire to make the world better, safer, the morality of crime or the immorality of crime, you'd say if that's people's kind of guiding inspiration, that it'll be a rewarding field for them to be involved in?
I can't think of any field that's more rewarding than criminology. There are other fields that are equally rewarding. I may retire to go into exercise physiology and do randomized controlled trials on how to get people to do more exercise. But it's hard to do that when we've got so many opportunities in criminology that will also keep people alive, although perhaps not as effectively as exercise.
Well, great. So, ask this question more formally. So, if you were to look back now in the course of your career and think about, we've talked about a bunch of your accomplishments and the successes, but do you mind talking about any setbacks in terms of things that you wanted to do and you couldn't pull them off?
Well, that's a very long list. But I think the most difficult setback was in 1985 when Patrick Murphy retired as president of the Police Foundation and I was vice president for research. And I had the strong support of the chairman of the board to become the next president. But I wasn't an ex-police officer, which Patrick Murphy certainly was. And I didn't do much for other messages about policing and the role of the Police Foundation. At the time, I thought the Police Foundation was by far the most influential institution for building bridges between knowledge and police practice. And it was because of my commitment to the work, great work that they had been doing and still have been doing, that I really wanted to be able to steer that ship and to become the next president of the Police Foundation. And it wasn't to be. The board of directors had a meeting in Houston, and at the end of that meeting, I wasn't going to be the president of the Police Foundation, and we flew back, and I spent the whole next day walking up the Potomac to Great Falls and back. It was a pretty cold, long, hard walk, and I ultimately decided to go off on my own anyway, because I really didn't want to have to go through approvals for designs of projects and setting priorities for my own work with anybody else. I had enormous respect for Patrick Murphy and worked very well with him, but at that point I decided I was going to go my own way, and it was probably the best thing in terms of developing the hotspots work and evidence-based policing. I don't think I would have done those things if I had been the chief executive of a complex organization with fundraising needs and lots of personnel. The appetite to be a chief executive is one that I've resisted ever since, including when I was invited to become dean on several occasions, and decided not to go down that track because it would have taken me too far away. But it was quite painful at the time, in part because I had fairly high expectations, and I just had to adjust to that not happening. And again, Bill Clinton liked to say it doesn't matter how many times you fall, what matters is how fast you get back up again. And I've tried to follow that philosophy during the many times I've fallen and gotten back up again, generally involving lots of exercise and sometimes involving some gin.
So the other analogy I've heard is no one remembers your batting average, they just remember your hits.
Yeah, Daniel Kahneman has the peak end rule, according to lots of perception research, that the happiest moment people have, or the most unhappy moment, helps to drive their memory of an experience, as well as how it ends. So if you make sure it doesn't end, and you just keep working as long as you can, then you can always be driven by the high points.
So one thing I'd love to hear from you about, because I don't think I've ever even asked you about this, and I think it would be great for people watching. So how do you actually pull off an experiment in a complex organization like the police, aside from knowing a police chief and kind of the serendipity? But that's not, just knowing somebody doesn't make it possible. So how does a criminologist actually make something like that happen?
Probably the same way you get elected to public office. It's a political campaign. You have to persuade people, to persuade other people that they know, to persuade other people that they know, in a networked process of building consensus around a particular choice. So if you're not running for office, you're not trying to get people's votes, you're trying to get their assent to allow an experiment to happen without objecting, or to support the experiment by referring cases into it, or to do other things that will give them co-ownership of the experiment. And Heather Strang and I just spent the weekend in Denmark introducing their first randomized trial in dealing with offenders in the Danish police. And in 7 police districts, we had mediators who were going to agree to be randomly assigned to have half of them use restorative justice conferences instead of straight victim offender mediation. But we started the whole project out, the whole weekend, the planning phase, with Danish criminologists saying that our primary purpose here is to build an experiment in which you will share ownership. And so we put lots of issues to them and got their input as to whether to do it this way or that way. And at the end of the weekend, several of them said, I felt included. I felt like somebody knew what I was thinking and saying. And it wasn't a huge group. It's about the size of the police officers I had to plan the Minneapolis experiment and the Minneapolis hotspots experiment, the domestic violence experiment, and the hotspots. Also Milwaukee, I mean, taking people away for a weekend who are going to actually participate in the experiment is a great way to build a sense of community. And very often it involves swimming pools. And this was hot springs in Denmark. We also had an experience in Milwaukee where they threw me and several other research team members into the pool fully clothed. But in my policing domestic violence book, I have a section called Bonding in the Pool. So we're creating social bonds. Right out of Travis Hershey, we want to be part of a family, if you will. Heather Strang's article is called Coalitions for a Common Purpose. And it is building coalitions, people with different interests and different ways in which they can help or hurt the experiment. You've got to map them out, and you've got to see the organization and its partners doing this experiment the way that a symphony conductor reads the full score of all the instruments and all the parts they're going to play, and is paying attention to every instrument in that orchestra and making sure they're all coming in together at the same time. So it did help that I was taught orchestration and had a chance to conduct Ravel's Bolero in my junior high school in Rockville, Maryland at the age of 12. And maybe that's why it felt so good for me to do experiments, because it was about bringing all these different pieces together. And I think if you approach an experiment as a yes-no policy decision, somebody's got to sign a piece of paper and the experiment is approved, and then you sit back and wait for the data to come in, it's not going to happen.
So you treat it more like a political campaign with the grassroots, the ground game, a network. What about, one of the things I've noticed is often scholars or aspiring scholars, they want to do something, they think it's going to be interesting, and they'll answer a question that they're interested in, that the field's interested in. But it's not necessarily something that a criminal justice agency is intrinsically interested in. So how do you convince, is it also about giving them an answer to something that they're interested? I mean, how do you balance that? Because I'm sure that I would imagine in Minneapolis, Chief Boza, right, was interested in knowing about the effect of domestic arrest for domestic violence, but he probably wasn't that interested in knowing about deterrence at the time.
Well, Tony Boza was appointed chief in late 1979, took office January 1st, 1980, by which time we'd already had these discussions. But I had come to him because of the continuing challenge of domestic abuse for American police practice that I had tracked since the New York City Police Department had this Family Crisis Intervention Unit designed by Dr. Morgan Bard, but without an experiment, without a good evaluation. And then the growing social movement for addressing domestic violence leading to that legal change. I came to Tony Boza and I said, look, you're under a lot of pressure about all this. He said, talk to the deputy mayor who came to the Police Foundation in Washington. As soon as I mentioned it to him, his eyes just lit up. So it's partly, I think, not a question of doing what you want to do, but of finding a way to converge with somebody else wanting something done that would make, in the words of Sesame Street, I've got milk, you got cookie. Oh, now we've both got milk and a cookie.
Right.
And that's exactly how that experiment happened. Because yes, deterrence theory is important, but when I read the National Academy of Science report on doing experiments in deterrence, and I read Frank Zimmering's work and his own book and his paper for that report, it struck me that I should think about opportunities for testing using sanctions versus not using them. And that one just jumped out at me right away because I've been to hundreds of domestic violence calls. And so this notion of reciprocity or mutuality, I think, is the best way to pick subjects for experimentation. In the case of restorative justice, John Braithwaite had a theory. He had met some people who were putting the New Zealand practices to work in Australia, and he said, look, I want you to design the experiments around this. So that at that point it became have research question, experiments will travel, and we apply the method, including the method of building the support. So I spent a lot of time talking with hundreds of police officers in the capital of Australia to get their support for the experiment. Not on a question that I had raised, but a question somebody had asked me to help answer. And so I told John Braithwaite he was like Jonas Salk with the Salk vaccine, and I was like the guy in public health at the University of Michigan whose name nobody ever remembers, but he was a great experimenter, and he ran the largest trial in history with 4 million school children, including me, in 1954. So, because that is a skill that has great value, that when something important comes up, if you're asked to serve, it's very satisfying to do that. So you don't have to drive your own research agenda.
You can look for opportunities.
Exactly.
Look for opportunities, things of common interest. So you don't have to answer the question, what's in it for me?
Well, I think that the the question of can you do a good research project is always central. And I have gotten well into negotiations and concluded that I can't do this well. So then I decide not to do it at all. And with experiments, that's particularly important. If you're not going to get treatment integrity where there's random assignment and then nobody does it, it's good. It's better not to go forward with that experiment.
Right.
And so we need to keep the excellence of research first and foremost, or at least in equal balance with the importance of the research question. But even an important research question can't be answered if you don't have the capacity to implement a good experiment politically in terms of power. I almost got the prosecutors in Milwaukee to randomly assign prosecution after arrest was randomly assigned. We came that close to it, and the prosecutor's wife talked him out of it. And the prosecutors didn't like it much either. So we dropped that.
There seems to be a bit of a vocabulary problem too. When we say random assignment, the legal community thinks that sounds somehow unfair. But have you thought about, is there a way that we could communicate, criminologists, but just social scientists more generally, on a vocabulary that would connect to policymakers and legal officials who just when they hear the word random, it sounds haphazard or unfair?
We use a lot of words. Controlled tests is one of them. Joel Garner once recommended that we talk about equal opportunity assignment, which is what random is.
Right.
And the Supreme Court's Federal Judicial Center issued a report in 1981, Experimentation in the Law, that said that actually experiments are probably less prone to prejudice, racial bias, and other things than normal discretionary practice. So that the ethics of it might be improving practice during the course of the experiment. But it went further and said that the ethical obligation is not to give everybody the best thing you think they can get in the circumstances, and that random assignment messes that up somehow. The best thing is to give them something that will help them because you know that from a controlled test. So it's your ethical duty to do an experiment as opposed to an ethical duty not to do random assignment. And that's been a very compelling argument to police, especially when we tell them about Scared Straight, where when they did the random assignment experiments, they found it was increasing crime rather than reducing crime. And many other examples, Cambridge, Somerville. We have good grounds to say, just because you want something to help people doesn't mean it will help people. And you can't tell me it's unethical to withhold something from people when it might actually be harmful. And as long as we have moral equipoise, enough evidence to believe that it could go this way or that way, the only ethical thing to do is to test it with controls. And if you have a fertile ground with open-minded people, increasingly that is a saleable idea. You can make people support that to produce the knowledge that they want to have as well.
Do you think that we need that kind of education in law schools as well?
Oh boy, that would be a big help. Statistical reasoning generally, I think, should become part of the legal curriculum, if only because we see decisions like the Supreme Court refusing to review a case in which sentencing was being done on a secret algorithm, one that the provider of the calculation didn't want to reveal for business reasons. But that's no reason to make justice secret, and I think it violates the U.S. Constitution. If lawyers, including judges, including members of the Supreme Court, understood more about how to analyze complex evidence, then we would have fewer comments of the kind that a Supreme Court justice recently made about, in quite a derogatory way, about social science. But again, we've got to sell lawyers early on.
On the value.
On the value.
On the value.
As you know, in the mid-20th century, there was a lot of interest in law and action and bringing behavioral sciences into law schools. Yale Law School now has Tom Tyler. He doesn't have a law degree, but he's a professor of law and teaching psychological theories and research methods. And it's good, but it's not enough. And we still have, I think, a lot of the culture of law being dominated by deciding what's right, independent of what the facts are. The law and the facts is the right way to go, as the Attorney General recently said. But if you don't understand statistical reasoning to interpret what the facts are, then you really can't meet that obligation to consider both the facts and the law.
It makes it very hard to judge about what you think the truth is if you don't understand the reasoning for the evidence that's being presented.
So every law school needs a criminologist, if not several.
And would you support then it being in class?
Yes, absolutely.
Evidence-based law, first-year law?
I think the first course anybody should take in law school is about the difference between legal reasoning and scientific reasoning, and the ways in which decisions like the Daubert versus Merrill Dow case have created a precedent for using science in a way that is peer-reviewed by other scientists in a process called the Daubert hearing, where a judge has to appoint a panel of experts to decide whether the expert witness in the case is expert enough to put the evidence to the jury or to the judges as fact finders. If lawyers knew from the outset that legal reasoning is fundamentally different from scientific reasoning, then I think they would be much more tolerant of scientific reasoning. And knowing that there are different ways of thinking about different questions, rather than that legal reasoning is the only way to answer every question.
So that brings me to another question based on your career. You've had a lot of success in running field trials, randomized controlled trials with police, or even in this case of restorative justice, effectively police and the courts. But you mentioned the struggle of trying to get a prosecutor to do a randomized trial. Why do you think the police have been more amenable in some ways to research than other aspects of other agencies of criminal justice, the courts, even corrections really hasn't been, from what I can tell, doing experiments the way that it used to, at least. Why have the police been more receptive?
Well, I think the police are more receptive than judges, in part because they aren't obstructed by having a very strong mindset around legal reasoning. The British police are actually taught a lot more law than American police. But in both cases, I think they're practical and they want to figure out what works to help people. And so just like they're interested in new technologies because there are better ways to get things done, I think the police have a very strong sense that as they act organizationally, so lots of people come together, then you need to test things organizationally. Whereas lawyers tend to think rather like the lone scholar in the library. It's one person thinking it through properly, standing up and making an oral argument, and being shot down or winning in front of a judge or a jury. It's much harder to have them imagine how they can explain something as complicated as a randomized controlled trial to a jury or even to a judge. Corrections actually did a lot more experiments long before policing came to play. And I fear that the demise of experimentation in corrections was a byproduct of the end of rehabilitation. And once we gave up trying to change offenders, what do we need to do experiments for?
We can just warehouse people.
Yeah, the question might really be, how do you cut the costs of feeding so many people and still not be sued for torture? And as California found out, well, you can't. So having that many people in your prisons is unconstitutional, and so you're going to have fewer people. But that's no basis for doing the kind of great experiments that they were doing in the 1960s, and might someday do again if rehabilitation comes back into fashion for the simple ground that it's a lot cheaper than warehousing people.
What do you think also rehabilitation, aside from falling out of favor politically, maybe even intellectually, also it struggles when systems are just crushed with the number of people that they have to deal with?
Yes, but you could say the same about British policing, which has had huge budget cuts and increases in demand, unprecedented levels of calls and crime reports, and pressure from the government to write up every single shove that can be considered an assault. So you've seen 300, 400% increases in reported violent crime in the last year in England, even though it's, according to the crime survey, really no change in violence. So they've got this massive number of cases to deal with. It is driving them into the arms of evidence-based policing, which can use data analytics to prioritize what is important to spend your time on and what you can justify not spending your time on, to put the proper amount of time where it will make a difference to increase public safety, to prevent harm. So I think it's paradoxical as to whether you respond to being overwhelmed with volume by doing more research rather than less. The inclination might be to do less research, but a lot of smart chief constables in the UK realize that if they're just going to make decisions by the seat of their pants, they're going to get criticized for it, no matter one way or the other. Somebody can argue with them. But if they have a good research basis for saying we're doing it this way and not that way, then they've got something they can rely on that the opposition can't take away, because they haven't done their own research to show a different conclusion.
So maybe does Cambridge have a program, similar program for correctional officials? So should the American Correctional Association join and create a master's program for mid-career folks to learn about evidence?
Absolutely. Evidence-based corrections could be brought back, and we don't have a program that does that kind of what works research in penology at Cambridge, but we could, and it doesn't have to be Cambridge, it could be Penn or other places in the United States that could bring mid-career professionals in and equip them with the tools for diagnosing and testing ways of dealing with the various problems that prisons have, including reoffending rates after people get out of prison, and all the work in the process of reentry. There's still tremendous potential for using experimental methods in those arenas as well. And I'm optimistic that Arnold Foundation and other people are trying to encourage that as we speak in 2017.
So you see, speaking of foundations, you've had a lot of experience working with grant funding agencies, the Police Foundation. What do you think about the role of philanthropic foundations in terms of driving evidence-based policing?
Oh, it's immense. We wouldn't have been able to do the work in Birmingham, England, with developing a diversionary program for first offenders who could be prosecuted even without their confessing their crimes. But we gave them the opportunity to start immediate rehabilitation the day after they got arrested on a voluntary basis with the police, and got this very substantial reduction in offender harm over the next 2 years. All of that was funded by a foundation that was created by a grocery store family, the Sainsburys, the Monument Trust of the Sainsbury family trusts. Wanted to reduce incarceration, wanted to find alternatives to deal with cases from the very beginning, and we could never have gotten that kind of leeway to deviate from the political doctrine of both the Labour and Conservative parties in England, that we must prosecute, no discretion, maximum punishment all the time. That's the only red meat that the voters will reward you for. And if you look soft on crime, then that's no good. So the foundation didn't want to look hard on crime, they wanted to be smart on crime. That's where you get the flexibility. And at various times in this country, I think it's also been true that there are ideas, there are tests that only private foundations will support, and not the government.
Great, so that's the area that people should be looking for more during times of political instability or just partisanship?
Well, the bad news is there's much more inequality of wealth. The good news is that all of this wealth concentrated at the top is increasing the giving to private foundations. So you have $18 billion more from Soros going into his Open Society Foundation. You have other philanthropists who are putting much more into those kinds of ventures. I would prefer to have a more equal society and less philanthropy, but as long as we have such an unequal society, it's good to harvest what you can from the independent thinking that philanthropies will allow.
Is there any kind of parting thoughts you had in terms of, it's been a very productive discussion, but any parting thoughts you have? I'm sure the viewers would welcome to hear them. I certainly would.
Well, just one final point that we were discussing the other day about where you spend your time. And it's very tempting for academics, especially those of us privileged to be in some of the best universities in the world, to spend all our time with other academics, either in that university or at conferences and meetings that are pushing back the boundaries of knowledge, and that you rely on the shared vocabulary, the shared conceptual frameworks of other very smart people. There's no doubt huge benefits for doing that, and it really works well in fields like mathematics. But what I would argue is that criminologists should try to balance their time between talking with brilliant academics and reading academic work, along with having contact with the people who are victims of crime, people who are committing crime, people who are dealing with those crimes, and to be able to draw just as much insight from your contact with the field settings that we are studying as you get from reading journal articles. And I think that without being preachy or even judgmental, the criminologists who are able to spend more time in personal contact with the field settings where crime and justice occurs, those criminologists, I would argue, are able to make bigger leaps, more important discoveries that will in turn help us to deal with these problems more effectively. It may not increase your citation count, it may not give you other metrics that you might prefer, even salary increases perhaps, but in terms of advancing the field, the roots of criminology are in those field settings, and the framework for thinking about them that comes from academic life needs to continually be refreshed by the contact with field observations. We don't all have to be ethnographers, but I think even the people doing the data analysis need to be watching and observing the things that the data are counting as the basis for that analysis. And I would, again, hope, speaking about graduate education, that graduate programs in criminology and criminal justice would try to discourage people from spending their careers at their desk and to encourage people to spend more time in prisons, in police cars, in courts, in probation offices, and even hanging out on street corners, as Elijah Anderson did for his PhD dissertation. All of those are ways of learning things that we can't learn, even in the era of big data. There are interpretations of big data, questions about how you would design the algorithms, what variables to look at, that can only be answered by field observations as well. And I criticize myself for not doing enough of it in recent years, but at least I spend a lot of time talking with people who are in direct contact with the field. And I was trying to think last night, have I spent more of the past year talking with serving police officers and leaders or with criminologists? And I can't tell which has been the majority, and that's probably a good thing. But I know that it has been a balance, and I commend it to anybody who wants to make a difference with criminology.
Larry. It's been a wonderful discussion and very educational. We've covered a lot of ground, so thank you for doing this.
Thank you, John.